On July 26, 1953, Arizona Governor Howard Pyle authorized what would become the largest child welfare raid in American history. At dawn, over 100 state police officers descended on the remote desert community of Short Creek, removing 263 children from their homes. The operation made national headlines, not for what authorities found, but for what they failed to stop. What Governor Pyle's officers discovered that morning wasn't simply illegal polygamous marriage practices. They had stumbled upon the early stages of what would become one of the most catastrophic genetic disasters in modern American history. But in 1953, without the benefit of genetic testing or comprehensive medical documentation, they couldn't possibly understand the full horror of what was unfolding in this isolated fundamentalist Mormon community. 25 years later, Dr. Theodore Tarby, a pediatric neurologist practicing in southern Utah, began documenting an impossible medical phenomenon. Children in Short Creek were being diagnosed with fumarase deficiency, a devastating neurological condition so rare that medical literature recorded fewer than a dozen cases worldwide. Dr. Tarby would eventually document over 20 cases in Short Creek alone. The statistical probability of this occurring naturally, 1 in several billion. By 1990, geneticists realized they weren't looking at random medical anomalies. They were witnessing the consequences of systematic genetic manipulation spanning multiple generations. Dr. Vinod Narayanan, a child neurologist who studied the community's genetic patterns, would later calculate that children in Short Creek were being born with fumarase deficiency at a rate 20,000 times higher than the general population. But the most chilling revelation came in 2008, when investigators examining Warren Jeffs' recorded teachings discovered something that transformed this from a tragic medical case into evidence of deliberate genetic engineering. Jeffs, the self-proclaimed prophet of the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, hadn't simply arranged marriages according to religious doctrine. He had implemented a sophisticated breeding program, treating his followers' DNA as raw material for creating what he believed would be a genetically purified priesthood bloodline. Medical documentation revealed that 65% of Short Creek's population descended from just 2 men. The community's coefficient of inbreeding, a statistical measure of genetic relatedness, reached 0.025, a level that geneticists typically only observe in laboratory animal colonies bred specifically for genetic uniformity. Short Creek hadn't just isolated itself from mainstream society. Warren Jeffs had transformed a religious community into a genetic prison where children paid the ultimate price for their prophet's obsession with bloodline purity. The 1953 raid failed catastrophically. Public sympathy sided with the polygamists. Authorities returned the children within 2 years, and Short Creek's leadership emerged stronger than ever. For the next 55 years, behind walls of religious secrecy and geographic isolation, the genetic catastrophe accelerated unchecked. By the time federal authorities finally intervened in 2008, 3 generations of children had been born into a genetic experiment that would leave hundreds with devastating, incurable neurological conditions. This is the story of how religious authority became genetic tyranny, how medical professionals fought for a decade to expose the truth, and how the children of Short Creek became casualties in their prophet's delusional quest for genetic perfectibility. Stay with me until the end, because what happened in Short Creek reveals the darkest consequences of fundamentalist control and why this community's bloodlines became a medical emergency that would forever change how we understand the intersection of religious freedom and child protection. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and whether you've heard about the genetic crisis in fundamentalist Mormon communities. The raid of 1953 should have been a warning. When social workers documented their initial observations, they noted unusually high rates of developmental delays, multiple families with children showing signs of severe cognitive impairment, and living conditions that suggested deliberate isolation from medical care. But in the Cold War era, with America gripped by fears of government overreach and communist infiltration, the spectacle of armed police removing children from their mothers played disastrously in the media. Newspapers across the country published photographs of weeping mothers separated from their children. Religious freedom advocates condemned the raid as religious persecution. Civil liberties organizations questioned the constitutional authority for such massive intervention. Within months, the political backlash forced authorities to retreat. The children were returned, the investigation was abandoned, and Short Creek's leadership learned a critical lesson. America's commitment to religious freedom could be weaponized to shield even the most disturbing practices from outside scrutiny. What no one understood in 1953 was that they had witnessed the beginning of a 70-year genetic experiment that would produce medical horrors unprecedented in modern Western society. The children removed in that raid were already the product of 3 generations of controlled breeding within 13 founding bloodlines. But the systematic genetic manipulation that would produce the fumarase deficiency epidemic hadn't yet begun in earnest. That would come later, under the prophetic leadership of men who believed they possessed divine authority to engineer human genetics according to their interpretation of celestial law. Short Creek occupies one of the most geographically isolated locations in the continental United States, straddling the border between Colorado City, Arizona, and Hilldale, Utah. The community sits in a high desert basin surrounded by dramatic red rock canyons and natural barriers that create what residents call the Fortress of God. The nearest major city lies over 300 miles away across largely uninhabited desert terrain. This isolation wasn't accidental. It was carefully chosen by the community's founders, specifically to create physical separation from government authority and mainstream Mormon society. The landscape itself reinforces this isolation. Access to Short Creek requires navigating narrow canyon roads that can be easily monitored and controlled. During the community's most restrictive periods, sentries stationed at these natural choke points recorded the license plates of every vehicle entering or leaving. The surrounding terrain, thousands of acres of canyon wilderness owned or controlled by the church, provided additional layers of protection from outside observation. Former members describe feeling that the very geography conspired to trap them. With escape routes few and heavily watched, to understand how Short Creek became a genetic catastrophe, we must first understand the religious schism that created it. In 1890, under intense federal pressure, the mainstream Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints officially abandoned the practice of polygamy. For many faithful Mormons, this represented an unacceptable compromise of divine commandment. They believed that plural marriage wasn't simply a lifestyle choice, but a mandatory requirement for achieving the highest degrees of celestial glory in the afterlife. By the 1920s, these fundamentalist believers faced increasing persecution from both federal authorities and the mainstream Mormon Church. They needed sanctuary, a place where they could practice plural marriage without interference. In 1929, a small group of fundamentalist families settled in the remote border region that would become Short Creek. The location was perfect, isolated enough to avoid easy government access, split between two state jurisdictions to complicate legal enforcement, and surrounded by land that could be purchased cheaply and controlled completely. These founding families established what they called the United Effort Plan in 1935, a communal property system where all land, homes, and resources belonged collectively to the church. Individual families received lifetime leases to homes and businesses, but the prophet maintained ultimate control over all property. This economic structure proved crucial to maintaining control over the community's genetics, because anyone who questioned the prophet's marriage directives risked losing not just their spiritual standing, but their home, livelihood, and access to their children. From these 13 founding families, Short Creek's genetic legacy began. The Jessops, Barlows, Johnsons, Steeds, and 9 other bloodlines would intermarry across the next 70 years, creating increasingly concentrated genetic relationships. But in those early decades, the community remained small enough, and its marriage patterns diverse enough, that severe genetic consequences hadn't yet emerged. That would change dramatically as prophetic control over marriage intensified. The theological foundation for what would become genetic disaster lay in fundamentalist Mormon doctrine about priesthood bloodlines. Leaders taught that certain family lines carried superior spiritual genetics, literal bloodline connections to the ancient Hebrew prophets, and ultimately to deity itself. Marrying within these worthy bloodlines wasn't just religiously preferable. It was presented as essential for producing children capable of holding priesthood authority in the coming millennial kingdom. Joseph White Musser, an early fundamentalist leader and Short Creek's spiritual architect, established the doctrinal framework in his extensive writings during the 1940s. He taught that the prophet received direct revelation about marriage assignments, that plural marriage concentrated righteous bloodlines, and that the community must maintain absolute separation from the corrupting influence of mainstream society. These teachings created the ideological justification for what would eventually become systematic genetic manipulation. When Leroy S. Johnson became FLDS prophet in 1954, he began implementing more rigid control over marriage practices. Johnson taught that all marriages must be assigned by prophetic revelation. Love matches and personal choice were evidence of worldly corruption. He maintained detailed genealogical records of the community's bloodlines and used these records to guide his marriage assignments. During his 32-year leadership, the practice of reassigning wives from unworthy men to worthy men became commonplace, further concentrating genetic relationships within favored bloodlines. The community's isolation intensified systematically. Members were forbidden from seeking medical care without prophetic approval. Children received limited education, with science classes eliminated entirely from the church-run school curriculum. Contact with outside family members who had left the community was prohibited. Television, radio, internet, and newspapers from outside the community were banned. This information control meant that even educated members had no access to basic genetics education that might have helped them understand the catastrophic consequences of their marriage patterns. By the time Rulon Jeffs assumed prophetic leadership in 1986, Short Creek had become what sociologists call a total institution, a closed society where leadership controlled every aspect of members' lives. Rulon, Warren Jeffs' father, systematized the practice of underage marriage and further concentrated the prophet's control over family formation. But it would be his son Warren who would transform religious polygamy into what medical professionals would eventually classify as systematic genetic abuse. The 1953 raid should have revealed everything, but the investigators didn't know what they were looking at. When Arizona State Police officers entered Short Creek's compounds that July morning, they documented living conditions that should have raised immediate red flags. Social workers noted multiple families where several children exhibited what appeared to be similar developmental abnormalities. Medical examinations revealed unusually high rates of seizure disorders, cognitive delays, and physical anomalies that suggested underlying genetic conditions. But in 1953, medical genetics remained a primitive science. DNA wouldn't be identified as the carrier of genetic information until later that year. The concept of founder effects and genetic bottlenecks existed primarily in agricultural breeding programs, not human population health. The examining physicians noted the abnormalities in their reports, but lacked the scientific framework to recognize what they were witnessing. The early stages of a genetic catastrophe caused by systematic inbreeding within a closed population. The raid's spectacular political failure ensured that Short Creek would remain closed to outside medical observation for decades. The community's leadership, emboldened by their victory, became even more determined to prevent government interference. Medical care from outside providers was increasingly forbidden. Women were instructed to give birth at home, attended only by community midwives who had no formal training and no legal obligation to report birth defects or genetic conditions to health authorities. For nearly 40 years, Short Creek's genetic problems remained hidden behind walls of religious secrecy and geographic isolation. Occasional medical encounters occurred when emergencies forced families to seek hospital care, but these incidents were treated as isolated cases rather than patterns. A child rushed to a hospital in St. George with uncontrollable seizures. A teenager whose developmental delays finally required intervention. A young mother whose baby was born with such severe abnormalities that even community midwives couldn't provide care. These scattered medical encounters began to create a disturbing picture for the few physicians who treated multiple Short Creek families. But patient confidentiality laws prevented them from sharing information, and the community's fierce resistance to medical authority meant they rarely saw the same families twice. The doctors who suspected genetic problems had no way to conduct population-level studies or genetic testing. They could document individual cases, but they couldn't prove a pattern. Everything changed in 1990 when Dr. Theodore Tarby, a pediatric neurologist practicing in Cedar City, Utah, examined a severely disabled child from Short Creek. The boy, approximately 8 years old, exhibited profound intellectual disability, suffered from frequent seizures, and had physical characteristics that Dr. Tarby initially couldn't explain. The child's mother, who had reluctantly brought him for evaluation after his seizures became life-threatening, refused to provide detailed family history and was clearly terrified of religious consequences for seeking outside medical care. Dr. Tarby ordered comprehensive testing, including metabolic screening that wasn't typically performed on children of this age. The results stunned him. The child had fumarase deficiency, an extremely rare autosomal recessive disorder that Dr. Tarby had never encountered in his practice. The condition results from mutations in the FH gene, which normally produces the enzyme fumarase. Without functional fumarase, affected individuals cannot properly metabolize fumaric acid, leading to severe developmental delays, seizures, and progressive neurological deterioration. The medical literature that Dr. Tarby consulted indicated that fewer than 20 cases of fumarase deficiency had been documented worldwide. The condition was so rare that many pediatric neurologists completed their entire careers without encountering a single case. The probability of randomly identifying a fumarase deficiency patient in a small regional practice in rural Utah approached 0, unless Dr. Tarby realized with growing horror the patient came from a population with extraordinarily high rates of consanguinity. Over the next 3 years, Dr. Tarby identified 3 more children from Short Creek with fumarase deficiency. Each case came to his attention only because seizures or developmental delays had become so severe that families violated community prohibitions against seeking medical care. Dr. Tarby knew that these 4 documented cases represented a fraction of the actual number, because most affected children never left the community for diagnosis. He began reaching out to other physicians in southern Utah and northern Arizona, asking if they had encountered similar cases. Dr. Vinod Narayanan, a child neurologist in Barrow Neurological Institute in Phoenix, confirmed he had documented 2 additional cases in children from Short Creek's Arizona side. Other physicians reported treating children from the community with seizure disorders and developmental delays, but hadn't performed the specialized metabolic testing necessary to confirm fumarase deficiency. By 1995, Dr. Tarby had documented sufficient cases to publish a case series in medical literature, but he faced a dilemma. Patient confidentiality prevented him from publicly identifying Short Creek as the source of this genetic cluster. The community's leadership, aware that their medical secrets were being exposed, pressured families even more aggressively to avoid outside health care. And without cooperation from the families themselves, Dr. Tarby couldn't conduct the comprehensive genetic testing and family history analysis necessary to prove the causative relationship between the community's marriage practices and the epidemic of genetic disease. When Dr. Tarby attempted to discuss his concerns with community leadership, requesting cooperation for genetic counseling and voluntary DNA testing, he received threatening responses. The FLDS leadership warned him that any attempt to interfere with their religious practices would be met with legal action. They characterized his genetic concerns as religious persecution, an attempt to use medical authority to discriminate against their faith. Several families who had previously brought children for treatment stopped coming, choosing to manage devastating medical conditions at home rather than risk prophetic disapproval. The resistance revealed something that Dr. Tarby found deeply disturbing. The community's leadership clearly understood that genetic testing would reveal extensive inbreeding. Their aggressive efforts to prevent medical investigation weren't motivated by ignorance about genetics. They were motivated by determination to conceal what they were doing. This wasn't accidental genetic disease emerging from innocent religious practice. This was deliberate concealment of genetic consequences that leadership understood but chose to perpetuate. In 1999, Dr. Tarba finally convinced several former FLDS members who had left the community to participate in genetic studies. The results confirmed what he had suspected. The families affected by fumarase deficiency shared recent common ancestors. Genetic analysis revealed that affected children's parents were, on average, more closely related than typical first cousins. The mutation causing fumarase deficiency was present in the community at extraordinarily high frequencies, indicating that it had been concentrated through multiple generations of close inbreeding within a small founding population. By 2000, Dr. Tarby had documented over a dozen confirmed cases of fumarase deficiency in Short Creek, more cases than had been identified in the rest of the world combined. But fumarase deficiency represented only the most visible genetic catastrophe. Other physicians working with FLDS families began documenting additional genetic conditions appearing at anomalous rates: severe combined immunodeficiency, Lee disease, and various other metabolic disorders. The statistical impossibility of this many rare genetic conditions appearing in a single small community finally forced medical professionals to recognize the horrifying truth. Short Creek wasn't simply experiencing elevated rates of genetic disease. The community had become a genetic nightmare created by systematic inbreeding over multiple generations, and the medical data that Dr. Tarby and his colleagues were documenting represented only the cases severe enough to force families to seek emergency care. Despite prophetic prohibition, the actual number of genetically affected children remained unknown, hidden behind walls of religious secrecy. Drop a comment if you think religious freedom has limits when children's health is at stake. To understand how Short Creek became a genetic catastrophe, we must examine the systematic process through which a religious community transformed itself into what geneticists would later describe as a closed breeding population exhibiting severe founder effects. This didn't happen accidentally. It required deliberate policies implemented across multiple generations, enforced through religious authority and social control mechanisms that made dissent nearly impossible. The genetic foundation began in 1929 with 13 founding families who settled in Short Creek. These families, the Jessups, Barlows, Johnsons, Steeds, Allreds, Blackmores, Cooks, Covingtons, Holm, Stubbs, Timpson, Roundy, and Richter lines, brought with them approximately 200 individuals who would become the genetic ancestors of nearly the entire future FLDS population in Short Creek. This initial genetic bottleneck meant that every subsequent generation would inherit DNA from an increasingly limited pool of ancestors. From 1929 through 1950, the community's first generation practiced polygamy, but without systematic prophetic control over marriage assignments. Men and women still exercised considerable personal choice about partners, though always within the community. During this period, genetic diversity remained relatively high because the founding population, while small, hadn't yet experienced the intensive inbreeding that would characterize later decades. The second generation, spanning 1950 to 1970, witnessed the beginning of systematic marriage control under Prophet Leroy S. Johnson. Johnson established the doctrinal principle that all marriages must be assigned through prophetic revelation. Love matches, he taught, represented worldly corruption and spiritual weakness. Johnson maintained detailed genealogical records and began using these records to guide marriage assignments, though his approach remained less systematic than what would develop under later leadership. During Johnson's era, the practice of reassigning wives from unworthy men to worthy men became institutionalized. When Johnson determined that a man had fallen from spiritual favor, he could command the man's wives and children be reassigned to another man deemed more righteous. This practice, which members called family restructuring, had profound genetic consequences. It meant that certain favored bloodlines, particularly the Jeffs and Barlow families, accumulated multiple wives and produced far more children than disfavored bloodlines. The third generation, from 1970 to 1990, experienced intensifying genetic concentration under continued Johnson leadership, and then under Rulon Jeffs, who became prophet in 1986. By this period, the marriage pool had constricted dramatically. Young people coming of age in the 1980s discovered they were often being assigned to marry first cousins or individuals who shared multiple recent common ancestors. The concept of prophetic revelation provided religious justification for marriages that members might otherwise have questioned on intuitive grounds. Medical documentation from this period reconstructed from hospital records and former member testimonies, reveals that genetic problems were becoming increasingly apparent to community members themselves. Multiple families had children with severe developmental delays. Seizure disorders affected numerous children. Physical deformities that suggested genetic causation appeared with disturbing frequency. But the community's information control meant that members lacked the scientific education to understand what they were witnessing, and religious doctrine taught them to interpret genetic disabilities as divine testing rather than consequences of inbreeding. Rulon Jeffs systematized prophetic marriage control even further, maintaining computerized databases of the community's genealogy and using these records to plan marriage assignments. But he also implemented another practice that would have catastrophic genetic consequences: mass reassignments. When Rulon determined that a man had become unworthy, he would simultaneously reassign dozens of wives and hundreds of children. Former members describe community meetings where 50 or more women would be told their eternal marriages were dissolved and they would be reassigned to new husbands, often within days. These mass reassignments created genetic bottlenecks within bottlenecks. Women who had been married to disfavored men were typically reassigned to the most favored priesthood holders. This meant that a small number of men, often already Rulon's blood relatives, were producing the majority of the next generation's children. Genetic analysis conducted after the 2008 raid would reveal that some men had fathered over 60 children through their multiple wives, while their brothers and cousins had been prohibited from marrying at all. When Warren Jeffs assumed prophetic control in 2002 following his father's death, he implemented genetic manipulation policies that can only be described as systematic eugenic engineering. Warren maintained his father's genealogical databases but expanded them dramatically, tracking not just family relationships, but what he called priesthood bloodlines, family lines he deemed genetically and spiritually superior. Former members who worked in the prophet's office describe seeing detailed charts mapping genetic relationships across the entire community. Warren's marriage assignments became increasingly focused on concentrating what he called pure priesthood blood. He assigned multiple teenage girls from favored bloodlines to elderly men from other favored bloodlines, creating genetic relationships that geneticists later calculated resulted in children whose parents were, on average, more closely related than full siblings in the general population. The coefficient of inbreeding, a statistical measure where 0 indicates no inbreeding and 0.25 indicates mating between full siblings, reached 0.025 in Short Creek, a level rarely seen outside deliberately inbred laboratory animal populations. Warren also implemented what former members describe as a breeding program for men he deemed to have superior genetics. These favored men, a group that included Warren himself, his brothers, and a small circle of close relatives, received assignments of multiple young wives, specifically selected from bloodlines Warren considered genetically desirable. One former member testified that Warren told him directly that he was being given 6 wives because his bloodline needed to be preserved and multiplied for the last days. The medical consequences became catastrophic during Warren's leadership. From 2002 to 2008, the rate of children born with fumarase deficiency reached its peak. Dr. Tarby's documentation from this period reveals that approximately 1 in 50 births in Short Creek involved children with this devastating condition, compared to an expected rate of 1 in 40 million in the general population. Other rare genetic conditions appeared with similar statistical impossibility. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Warren Jeffs' genetic engineering wasn't the inbreeding itself. It was the deliberate suppression of medical care for genetically disabled children. Former members describe being told that genetic conditions represented God's punishment for unworthiness or testing of faith. Families with disabled children were sometimes told they were being punished for their ancestors' sins. This religious framing prevented families from seeking medical care and created profound guilt that compounded their children's suffering. Warren also implemented policies that effectively prevented certain bloodlines from reproducing at all. Young men from families deemed unworthy were systematically expelled from the community before reaching marriage age in a practice that members called the Lost Boys. Over 500 young men were cast out during Warren's leadership, often driven hundreds of miles from Short Creek and abandoned without resources, education, or family connections. This selective expulsion of males from disfavored bloodlines, while concentrating reproduction among favored families, created exactly the conditions that population geneticists recognize as likely to produce severe genetic consequences. The living conditions in Short Creek during this period reflected the community's complete isolation from mainstream medical and scientific knowledge. The community-run school eliminated all science education. Children learned that dinosaur fossils were placed by Satan to deceive the faithful. Human reproduction was taught solely in religious terms, with no discussion of genetics, heredity, or biological relationships. Adults had no access to genetic counseling, family planning information, or basic education about inherited disorders. Healthcare prohibition became absolute under Warren's leadership. He taught that seeking medical care without prophetic approval represented a lack of faith that would result in loss of salvation. Women were instructed to give birth at home, attended only by community midwives who had no formal training. When children were born with obvious genetic abnormalities, families were told to hide them from outside authorities. Former members described children with severe disabilities who were kept hidden in back rooms, never allowed outside where outsiders might see them, receiving no medical treatment whatsoever for conditions that modern medicine could have managed. The economic control system ensured that families couldn't leave even when they recognized their children needed medical care. Under the United Effort Plan, families owned nothing. Their homes, vehicles, businesses, and even their children's clothing technically belonged to the church. Leaving meant abandoning everything with no resources, no outside job skills, and often no contact with anyone outside the community. This economic entrapment meant that parents watched their children suffer from treatable genetic conditions rather than risk losing everything by seeking outside help. Dr. Vinod Narayanan, who studied Short Creek's genetics extensively after the 2008 intervention, described the community as a population genetics experiment that no ethical researcher would ever design. The genetic data revealed inbreeding levels comparable to endangered species breeding programs, where geneticists work desperately to prevent exactly the kind of genetic collapse that Warren Jeffs had deliberately engineered. Population genetic analysis revealed that 65% of Short Creek's population descended from just two men, John Y. Barlow and Joseph Smith Jessup, who had been prolific polygamists in the community's early generations. This meant that most marriages in the 2000s involved individuals who shared these recent common ancestors multiple times in their family trees. The genetic analysis showed that affected children's parents were, on average, as closely related as half-siblings, a level of consanguinity that geneticists consider extremely high risk for autosomal recessive conditions. The legal intervention that would finally expose Short Creek's genetic catastrophe began not with medical authorities, but with law enforcement investigating Warren Jeffs for child sexual assault. In 2005, Arizona authorities filed charges against Warren for arranging marriages between adult men and underage girls. The criminal investigation, initially focused on sexual abuse, would inadvertently expose the genetic nightmare that medical professionals had been documenting for 15 years. When investigators began examining FLDS marriage records and community documents, they discovered something unexpected: detailed genealogical databases that Warren maintained on church computers. These weren't simple family trees. They were sophisticated breeding records that tracked genetic relationships across the entire community. Former members who defected and cooperated with investigators described seeing Warren consult these databases before making marriage assignments, specifically selecting marriage partners based on their bloodline relationships. In 2006, Warren Jeffs was placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list, not for genetic manipulation, but for unlawful flight to avoid prosecution on the sexual assault charges. He was captured in August 2006 during a traffic stop in Nevada, driving a red Cadillac Escalade with temporary license plates, accompanied by one of his wives and carrying $70,000 in cash, multiple cell phones, and laptop computers containing the marriage records that would become crucial evidence. The computers seized during Warren's arrest contained thousands of pages of documents detailing his marriage assignments, including explicit instructions about which bloodlines should be concentrated through plural marriage. In recorded audio teachings that investigators found, Warren discussed bloodlines in explicitly genetic terms, talking about pure priesthood genetics and the need to concentrate the holy seed. These recordings demonstrated that Warren understood he was manipulating human genetics. This wasn't religious practice conducted in genetic ignorance, but deliberate eugenic engineering cloaked in religious language. While Warren sat in jail, awaiting trial on the Arizona charges, FLDS leadership continued operating the Short Creek community and an expanded compound in El Dorado, Texas, called the Yearning for Zion Ranch. In 2008, Texas authorities received reports of underage marriages and child abuse at the Texas compound. On April 3, 2008, law enforcement and Child Protective Services executed a search warrant and entered the Yearning for Zion Ranch. What Texas authorities discovered exceeded their worst expectations. The compound housed over 700 people, including 468 children. Medical examinations revealed that numerous teenage girls had been married to adult men and were either pregnant or already mothers. But the medical team also discovered something else: multiple children with obvious signs of genetic conditions. Preliminary medical screening identified at least a dozen children with developmental delays, physical anomalies, and neurological symptoms consistent with genetic disorders. Texas Child Protective Services made the unprecedented decision to remove all 468 children from FLDS custody, pending investigation. The removal sparked immediate legal challenges from FLDS attorneys, who argued that removing children based on the community's collective practices violated constitutional protections. But as medical examinations continued, the genetic evidence became overwhelming. Dr. Bruce Perry, a child psychiatrist who examined many of the removed children, testified that he had never seen a population with such high rates of genetic abnormalities outside of isolated island populations or deliberately inbred animal colonies. Genetic testing, ordered by Texas authorities, revealed that many of the children were products of marriages between close relatives. In some cases, parents were more closely related than first cousins. In several cases, genetic testing suggested that parents might have been uncle-niece or aunt-nephew combinations, relationships so close that most states prohibit them by law. The Texas court hearings revealed the extent of Warren's genetic engineering program. Former members testified that Warren had maintained what they called the heavenly session, a private meeting where he would receive revelation about marriage assignments. But testimony from his former clerical staff revealed that these revelations came only after Warren spent hours consulting his genealogical databases, specifically calculating genetic relationships between potential marriage partners. One particularly damning piece of evidence came from Warren's own recorded teachings. In an audio file recovered from the seized computers, Warren explained to a group of men that he was assigning them young wives from specific bloodlines because we must concentrate the pure bloodlines for the last days. He explicitly discussed the need to preserve the genetics of the priesthood and prevent genetic contamination from the outside world. These statements made clear that Warren understood exactly what he was doing genetically and chose to continue anyway. The legal breakthrough came when prosecutors combined the sexual assault charges with evidence of systematic genetic harm. Medical experts testified that the pattern of genetic disease in Short Creek and at the Yearning for Zion Ranch couldn't have occurred accidentally. Dr. Theodore Tarby, who had documented the fumarase deficiency cases for nearly 2 decades, provided detailed testimony explaining how the marriage patterns Warren had implemented guaranteed that rare genetic conditions would appear at catastrophic rates. Dr. Lynn Jord, a geneticist from the University of Utah who specialized in population genetics, testified as an expert witness. He explained to the court that Short Creek exhibited genetic patterns typically seen only in endangered species or laboratory breeding colonies. He calculated that the probability of the observed genetic disease rates occurring by chance approached 0. The only explanation, Dr. Jord testified, was systematic inbreeding maintained across multiple generations, exactly what Warren's marriage assignment records documented. The Texas Supreme Court ultimately ruled that removing all 468 children had been overly broad, and most children were returned to their families with court-ordered medical monitoring. But the genetic evidence collected during those medical examinations became crucial to the criminal prosecutions. Warren Jeffs faced trial in Utah in 2007 for being an accomplice to rape, specifically for arranging the marriage of a 14-year-old girl to her 19-year-old cousin. He was convicted and sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of 5 years to life in prison. However, that conviction was later overturned on procedural grounds. Warren then faced trial in Texas on charges of sexual assault of children, charges stemming from his own marriages to underage girls, including a 12-year-old and a 15-year-old. The Texas trial included the devastating DNA evidence showing that Warren himself had fathered a child with the 12-year-old victim. In August 2011, Warren Jeffs was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, plus 20 years. But Warren's conviction didn't end the legal proceedings. Federal prosecutors launched a massive investigation into the United Effort Plan, arguing that the communal property system had been used to facilitate sexual abuse and genetic harm. In 2014, federal courts seized control of the UEP, appointing an independent fiduciary to manage the trust and distribute property to individual families. This broke the economic control system that had trapped families in the community even when they wanted to leave. Multiple other FLDS leaders faced prosecution for their roles in arranging underage marriages. Seth Jeffs, Warren's brother, was convicted in South Dakota in 2017. Lyle Jeffs, another brother who had served as Warren's lieutenant, was convicted of conspiracy and food stamp fraud charges related to a scheme that funneled resources to FLDS leadership, while rank-and-file members suffered poverty. The systematic prosecution of FLDS leadership sent a clear message. Religious freedom does not protect child abuse or genetic harm. Former FLDS member Rebecca Musser, who had been married to Warren's father, Rulon Jeffs, when she was 19 and he was 85, became a key witness in multiple trials. Her testimony about the marriage assignment system and the way prophetic control operated provided crucial insider perspective. She testified that women were explicitly treated as breeding stock, valued primarily for their ability to produce children from favored bloodlines. Her book, The Witness Wore Red, became a definitive account of life inside the FLDS and the systematic nature of the abuse. Carolyn Jessup, another former member who escaped with her 8 children in 2003, provided testimony about how families with genetically disabled children were treated. She described seeing severely disabled children hidden away, denied medical care, and blamed for their own suffering. Her testimony helped prosecutors establish that FLDS leadership knew about the genetic consequences of their marriage policies, but chose to continue them anyway, evidence of willful disregard for children's welfare. The legal proceedings ultimately established several crucial precedents. Courts ruled that religious freedom does not protect systematic child sexual abuse, even when framed as religious marriage. They ruled that genetic harm to children, when predictable and preventable, can constitute child abuse. And they ruled that communities cannot use religious doctrine to prevent children from accessing necessary medical care. These legal principles would reshape how courts approach religious freedom cases involving children's health and safety. The collapse of Warren Jeffs' leadership created a crisis of unprecedented proportions in Short Creek. By 2011, with Warren imprisoned and the United Effort Plan seized by federal authorities, the community faced the challenge of rebuilding while confronting the genetic legacy of 70 years of systematic inbreeding. The children born with devastating genetic conditions needed immediate medical intervention. The families who had been trapped by economic and religious control needed support to transition to independent living, and the community as a whole needed education about genetics to prevent future generations from suffering the same fate. The medical intervention began immediately after the Texas raid. Health authorities in both Arizona and Utah established specialized clinics in Short Creek to provide comprehensive health care to community members, many of whom had never received professional medical care in their lives. These clinics faced extraordinary challenges. Many families deeply distrusted outside medical authorities, having been taught for decades that doctors represented Satan's influence. Language barriers existed, not foreign languages, but medical terminology that had no equivalent in the isolated community's vocabulary. Dr. Reed Ford, a pediatrician who volunteered at the Short Creek Medical Clinic from 2009 through 2015, described the experience as unlike anything in his career. He encountered children who had suffered for years with treatable conditions because their families believed seeking medical care demonstrated weak faith. He met teenagers who had never received vaccinations, dental care, or vision screening, and he documented dozens of children with genetic conditions ranging from mild developmental delays to profound disabilities requiring lifetime medical support. The genetic counseling program proved particularly crucial and particularly challenging. Geneticists had to explain basic heredity concepts to adults who had received virtually no science education. They had to overcome religious teachings that framed genetic disease as divine punishment rather than biological consequence, and they had to do this while respecting the community's continuing religious beliefs, carefully separating legitimate faith from the harmful doctrines that had caused the genetic crisis. The counseling sessions revealed the extent of genetic damage in ways that medical testing alone couldn't capture. Genetic counselors interviewed hundreds of families, constructing detailed family trees that documented the marriage patterns across generations. These genealogical reconstructions showed that virtually every family in Short Creek had been affected. Even families without children showing obvious genetic conditions carried recessive mutations that could emerge in future generations if inbreeding continued. For families with genetically disabled children, the rehabilitation process involved not just medical care but profound psychological healing. Many parents had been taught that their children's disabilities represented punishment for their own unworthiness. The guilt these families carried was devastating. Counselors had to help parents understand that they weren't responsible for genetic consequences that resulted from a marriage system they had no power to resist. This therapeutic work often took years, as families processed the trauma of watching their children suffer while being told by religious leaders that seeking help represented spiritual weakness. The community's economic rehabilitation required dismantling the United Effort Plan's control over property and resources. The court-appointed fiduciary began the complex process of converting lifetime leases into actual property ownership, giving families legal title to the homes they had occupied for generations. This property distribution created conflicts. Some families had occupied larger, better-maintained properties, while others lived in deteriorating structures. The fiduciary had to balance fairness with the practical reality that wholesale redistribution would create new injustices. Educational intervention became critical for the community's long-term recovery. The FLDS-controlled school had systematically denied children access to standard curriculum, particularly in science. Many teenagers had received minimal mathematics education, no biology or chemistry, and historical instruction limited to religious narratives. Public schools established special programs to help FLDS children transition to mainstream education, but the gaps proved daunting. Some teenagers who left the community in their mid-teens were reading at elementary levels. The lost boys, the hundreds of young men who had been expelled from Short Creek before marriage age, represented a particularly tragic aspect of the genetic engineering program. These young men had been deliberately cast out to eliminate their genetics from the community's gene pool. Many had survived homelessness, substance abuse, and profound psychological trauma after being abandoned by the only community they had ever known. Social service organizations in Las Vegas, St. George, and Salt Lake City established programs specifically to help these young men, providing education, job training, and counseling. Former FLDS members who had escaped years earlier played crucial roles in helping newly departing families adjust to life outside the community. These former members understood the psychological challenges of leaving, the guilt, the fear of damnation, the practical difficulties of navigating a world for which they had no preparation. Support networks emerged, with former members mentoring those just beginning their transition, teaching basic skills like banking, shopping, and interacting with non-FLDS society. The community's transformation wasn't uniform. Some families embraced the opportunity for change, eagerly pursuing education and medical care. Others resisted, Continuing to follow Warren's teachings even from prison, Warren maintained communication with followers through letters and phone calls, attempting to direct the community from behind bars. Some families continued to revere him as a prophet, while others came to see him as the architect of their suffering. By 2015, Short Creek had effectively split into 3 groups: those who had completely left the FLDS and were rebuilding their lives independently, those who remained FLDS but rejected Warren's authority and attempted to reform the religion, and a shrinking group who continued following Warren's directives. This fragmentation created new tensions as families divided along ideological lines, with siblings and parents sometimes ending up in different factions. The medical research emerging from Short Creek's genetic crisis produced valuable contributions to scientific understanding of rare genetic diseases. The concentration of fumarase deficiency cases allowed researchers to study the condition's progression and develop better management protocols. Research papers published in medical genetics journals used Short Creek as a case study in founder effects, genetic bottlenecks, and the medical consequences of sustained consanguinity. The community that had hidden its genetic problems for 70 years became one of the most extensively documented examples of human population genetics in medical literature. Mental health services became increasingly recognized as essential to the community's recovery. The psychological impact of discovering that religious leaders had deliberately engineered genetic suffering proved devastating for many former members. Depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress affected community members at rates far higher than the general population. Specialized therapists who understood both the religious trauma and the genetic grief worked with families processing incredibly complex emotional challenges. For the children born with genetic conditions, the question of long-term care remained urgent. Fumarase deficiency is progressive and ultimately fatal. Most affected children die before adulthood, though some survive into their 20s with intensive medical support. The families caring for these children needed not just current medical care, but planning for their children's futures, a future that would likely involve increasing disability and early death. Hospice organizations developed specialized programs to support these families through the inevitable loss of their genetically damaged children. The community's women, who had been systematically denied education and economic independence, faced particular challenges in rehabilitation. Many had married as teenagers, had never worked outside the home, and possessed minimal education. Programs teaching basic financial literacy, job skills, and practical independence became lifelines for women trying to support themselves and their children after leaving the FLDS. Organizations like the Hope Organization and the Holding Out Help Foundation provided specifically tailored assistance for former FLDS women. Perhaps most remarkably, some former FLDS members became advocates for genetic awareness and child protection. Women who had been forced into arranged marriages spoke publicly about the genetic consequences of prophetic marriage control. They testified before state legislatures considering laws to strengthen child protection in religious communities. They shared their stories in media interviews, documentaries, and books, transforming their suffering into public education that might prevent similar tragedies in other isolated religious groups. The broader medical community drew important lessons from Short Creek. Pediatricians and geneticists received training in recognizing signs of systematic genetic abuse in isolated religious populations. Medical reporting protocols were enhanced to better identify clusters of rare genetic conditions that might indicate inbreeding. And medical schools incorporated Short Creek into their ethics curriculum, using it as a case study in balancing respect for religious freedom with mandatory reporting of child medical neglect. The physical transformation of Short Creek itself reflected the community's transition. The massive compounds where Warren's favored families had lived stood empty or were subdivided into smaller units. The guard towers that had monitored access to the community were dismantled. Fences came down. Satellite dishes appeared on homes as families gained access to outside information for the first time. The visual landscape of the community shifted from fortified isolation to something resembling a normal small town. But the genetic legacy couldn't be erased so easily. By 2020, medical tracking showed that approximately 5% of Short Creek's population carried genetic mutations that could cause severe conditions in future generations if carriers married each other. The genetic counseling program emphasized the critical importance of genetic testing before marriage and strongly encouraged community members to seek partners from outside the historically FLDS population. Some former members chose to leave Short Creek entirely, moving to cities where their children wouldn't face any social pressure to marry within the community. The cost of medical care for genetically affected children became a significant burden. Many families qualified for Medicaid and disability support, but the specialized care required for conditions like fumarase deficiency often exceeded standard coverage. Medical debt became crushing for families who had already lost everything when they left the FLDS. Charitable organizations and medical centers absorbed costs where possible, recognizing that these families shouldn't bear financial punishment for genetic consequences they hadn't chosen. Tell us in the comments, should there be better oversight of isolated religious communities to prevent genetic harm? 15 years after Warren Jeffs' conviction, Short Creek stands as a living testament to both the catastrophic consequences of religious extremism and the remarkable resilience of human communities. The genetic crisis that emerged from 70 years of systematic inbreeding continues to affect hundreds of individuals, but the community has transformed from a closed religious compound into something approaching a normal American town. The question isn't whether Short Creek survived. It's what lessons we've learned, and whether we're prepared to prevent similar genetic disasters in other isolated communities. Dr. Theodore Tarby retired from active practice in 2018, but his final interviews provide sobering perspective on what he witnessed. I spent 25 years documenting what happens when religious authority controls human genetics, Tarby reflected in a 2018 medical journal interview. Short Creek wasn't just practicing polygamy. They were conducting genetic experiments on their own children. Warren Jeffs created a system where genetic suffering was inevitable, and children were sacrificed for their leaders' delusions of genetic purity. The medical community learned from Short Creek that silence in the face of genetic abuse is complicity. We have a responsibility to protect children, regardless of their parents' religious beliefs. Tarby's documentation of the fumarase deficiency epidemic became the foundation for enhanced medical reporting protocols now used nationwide. When physicians encounter clusters of rare genetic conditions, they're now trained to investigate whether systematic inbreeding might be occurring. Medical associations developed guidelines for approaching isolated religious communities where genetic concerns exist, balancing respect for religious freedom with mandatory child protection reporting. Tarby's work transformed how the medical profession understands its obligations when treating populations exhibiting signs of genetic abuse. Former FLDS member Carolyn Jessup, who escaped in 2003, and later testified in multiple court proceedings, offered her perspective in a 2019 interview. Warren Jeffs didn't just control our marriages, he controlled our DNA. He decided which bloodlines were worthy, which children would be born healthy, and which would suffer. I watched children born with terrible genetic conditions while their parents were told it was God's will. It wasn't God's will. It was the inevitable result of treating human beings like breeding animals. Our children deserved better than to be experiments in his twisted vision of genetic perfectibility. Jessup's testimony, along with that of other former members, proved crucial in establishing legal precedents about religious freedom's limits. Courts ruled repeatedly that religious doctrine cannot justify knowingly creating conditions that cause predictable harm to children. These rulings have been cited in cases involving vaccine refusal, medical neglect, and other situations where religious beliefs conflict with children's health needs. The Short Creek precedents established that when adults' religious practices create scientifically predictable harm to children, the state has not just the right, but the obligation to intervene. The genetic research emerging from Short Creek continues to contribute to scientific understanding. Population geneticists use Short Creek data to study founder effects, genetic drift, and the mathematics of inbreeding depression. Medical researchers studying rare autosomal recessive conditions have unprecedented data from the concentration of cases in Short Creek. Dr. Lynn Jord, the University of Utah geneticist who testified in the legal proceedings, noted that Short Creek represents the most extensively documented case of human population genetics under conditions of extreme inbreeding. While the circumstances are tragic, the scientific data will help us understand and prevent genetic diseases for generations. The medical literature now includes over 30 published research papers specifically studying Short Creek's genetics. These papers appear in leading journals including the American Journal of Human Genetics, Molecular Genetics, and Metabolism, and the Journal of Medical Genetics. Medical students worldwide study Short Creek as a case example of population genetics principles. What was hidden for 70 years behind walls of religious secrecy has become one of the most thoroughly documented genetic phenomena in medical science. But beyond the scientific legacy, Short Creek's story forced America to confront uncomfortable questions about how we balance competing values. How far does religious freedom extend? At what point does the state's obligation to protect children override parents' religious autonomy? Can communities isolate themselves so completely that their children suffer preventable harm? These questions have no easy answers, but Short Creek demonstrated that some lines must exist, that religious freedom cannot become a shield for systematic genetic abuse. Policy changes at both state and federal levels emerged from the Short Creek crisis. Utah and Arizona both strengthened their laws regarding genetic counseling in high-risk populations. Medical reporting requirements were enhanced to better identify clusters of genetic disease that might indicate systematic inbreeding. Child Protective Services developed specialized protocols for investigating isolated religious communities while respecting legitimate religious practice. These policy reforms built on the painful lessons learned from 70 years of genetic suffering in Short Creek. The HOPE organization and similar support networks for former FLDS members continue operating today, helping individuals and families transition from the community. These organizations report that new people leave Short Creek every year, seeking education, medical care, and freedom from the genetic and psychological legacy of FLDS control. Many former members describe their decision to leave in explicitly genetic terms. They want their children to have healthy futures unconstrained by the genetic damage accumulated across generations. The community's children, those born after Warren's imprisonment and raised with access to education and medical care, represent hope for a different future. These children attend public schools, receive comprehensive health care, and learn actual science, including genetics and human biology. They understand what their parents' generation couldn't, that genetic disease isn't divine punishment, but biological consequence, that inbreeding causes predictable harm, and that they have choices their ancestors didn't. Yet the genetic legacy persists in ways that won't resolve for generations. Carriers of recessive mutations remain in the population. Some former FLDS members who married within the community now know they both carry genes that could cause their children devastating genetic conditions. These couples face agonizing decisions about family planning, genetic testing, and what risks they're willing to take. The genetic prison Warren Jeffs created doesn't unlock simply because he's behind bars. The psychological legacy may prove even more enduring than the genetic one. Former members describe profound identity crises as they process the reality that their entire worldview was constructed to facilitate genetic abuse. They struggle with questions of faith. Can they maintain belief in God while rejecting the prophets who claimed to speak for him? They wrestle with forgiveness. Can they forgive parents who arranged damaging marriages, leaders who knew the genetic consequences but continued anyway, a community that chose religious conformity over children's health? Warren Jeffs remains imprisoned in Texas, serving his life sentence plus 20 years. He continues attempting to direct FLDS followers through letters and phone calls, though his influence has diminished dramatically. Some former members report that even from prison, Warren tries to arrange marriages and direct community affairs. But his power to cause genetic harm has been broken. The genealogical databases he maintained have been studied by geneticists. The marriage assignment system he controlled has been dismantled. The children being born today in Short Creek come from marriages based on choice, not prophetic revelation designed to concentrate bloodlines. The question of accountability remains complex. Warren Jeffs was convicted of sexual assault, not genetic abuse. Because in 2011, no laws specifically addressed systematic genetic harm to children. Legal scholars continue debating whether new laws are needed, or whether existing child abuse statutes adequately cover knowingly creating conditions likely to cause genetic disease. Some advocates argue for specific legislation prohibiting systematic inbreeding in isolated communities. Others worry that such laws could be used to target minority religious groups inappropriately. The broader implications extend beyond fundamentalist Mormonism. Other isolated religious communities, from strict Mennonite groups to certain Hasidic Jewish communities, also practice endogamy and sometimes exhibit elevated rates of genetic disease. Public health officials working with these communities must balance medical advocacy with cultural sensitivity. Short Creek's lessons inform these efforts. Genetic education must be provided respectfully. Genetic counseling must be accessible, and medical professionals must remain vigilant for signs of systematic genetic harm while respecting legitimate religious practice. The documentary record of Short Creek, the medical files, court testimony, audio recordings, and survivor accounts now resides in archives at the University of Utah, Arizona State University, and the National Library of Medicine. Researchers, journalists, and documentary filmmakers continue examining this material, mining it for insights into religious extremism, population genetics, and child protection. What Warren Jeffs tried to hide has become one of the most thoroughly documented cases of systematic abuse in American history. Perhaps the most powerful legacy comes from the survivors who transformed their suffering into advocacy. Women who were married as children now testify before legislatures. Men who were expelled as teenagers now help others escape. Children who were born with genetic conditions their parents couldn't prevent now speak about the importance of genetic education and medical access. They ensure that Short Creek's genetic nightmare isn't forgotten, because remembering prevents repetition. The final call to vigilance resonates beyond Short Creek. As genetic technologies advance and our understanding of DNA manipulation grows, we must remember the children who paid the price for their leaders' genetic fantasies. The genetic crisis in Short Creek ended not because religious leaders gained wisdom, but because medical professionals documented the truth and legal authorities finally acted. Dr. Tarby's 2 decades of careful documentation, survivor testimony, and genetic evidence combined to break through walls of religious secrecy that had protected systematic abuse for 70 years. Today, as we advance genetic technologies and understand DNA manipulation at levels Warren Jeffs could never have imagined, we must remember the fundamental principle that Short Creek demonstrated. No religious belief justifies genetic suffering. No prophet's revelation excuses knowingly creating conditions that harm children. No interpretation of Scripture permits systematic genetic abuse. Because Short Creek proved that when religious authority controls human reproduction, children become victims of their leaders' genetic fantasies. The price of genetic purity is always paid by the innocent. Final question for the comments. What should happen to religious leaders who knowingly create genetic harm? Let us know what you think, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into America's hidden histories.